1971. The Vietnam Experience. 1971 and 1972. Years go by. Nixon was president. The Godfather movie was released. The Libertarians had their first convention, and I was drafted for the military. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was 18 and just graduated high school in May. My mother and father were there to see me released into the world of hard work and dedication. However, that was not the case, as I decided to fight for a cause and signed up for the Army in June of 1972. After 3 months of boot camp, learning how to fight hand-to-hand combat and weapons training, I was shipped off from my boot camp to my home of Travis County, Texas, to San Diego to be deployed. While in San Diego, I was shipped on a plane to a mysterious land known as Vietnam. I'd only heard about the mysteries of Vietnam in local news. It was mostly stories about missing in action and prisoners of war in the North Vietnam camps, which I heard about. These men who were found deep in the jungle slaughtered to death by the red evil known as the Vietcong. However, I still continued with no regrets, thinking I was going to fight for the freedom of the Vietnamese people from an evil cause and liberate them for the better good of the world. Going from San Diego to Vietnam was a harsh plane ride, especially with all the storms going across the Pacific Ocean. However, to pass the time, I talked to some of the other fellows on the plane. First was a guy from Austin, Texas, known as Paul. Paul was an 18-year-old high school flunk who decided that his only path after school was to go into the Army. Paul's sense of employment made him a happy man with no real problems. There was also a kid from California named Carson, who was from Stockton, California. Carson was of half Vietnamese, half Irish descent and decided to fight for South Vietnamese cause. He spoke fluent Vietnamese and English from his mother's side, and he would always be cracking swear words in Vietnamese. He obviously was the quirkiest kid from the group, being this 20-something fella who was always cracking jokes to make everyone feel better. I soon befriended the two fellows, and we were the best of buddies after the end of the flight. We arrived at the military base in Saigon, and we were allowed a few days to roam the city before the deployment into the jungle. While time was on my side, I ventured onto the streets of Saigon. I stumbled on an old bookstore in which I took a peek inside to reveal several thousands of books, mostly written in Vietnamese. The woman behind the counter looked at me and then went to the back. I decided to look at the folklore section, which was full of stories told by locals and traditions past. I then saw a book in English, which looked a little worn, and decided to take a peek. I opened up to page 1 and found an image of a frightening dragon with red eyes. I wasn't scared, but decided to read the story anyways. It mostly talked about a dragon which roamed the jungle looking for prey unless someone had offered it as sacrifice. After reading it, I decided it was the cheesiest read I'd ever laid upon. However, as I turned around, the shopkeeper looked at me and said politely in English, "You better walk with your eyes open in those trees," and then walked away. I was kind of confused, but just walked out and proceeded to the base. After a few days in Saigon, we were given our mission. And being privates, we would be the first ones sent in to investigate the Vietcong and would investigate the local jungles nearby the border. Most notably, the missing pioneers within the thick jungle. Me and about 200 men were shipped off in jeeps into the battle zone, specifically the border between the North and South Vietnam. Arriving on our destination, it was a very quiet place. Nothing but the chirps of small birds in the distance. It was a large ancient jungle which didn't seem to be of anything really. The man in charge told us to get ready and set up camp, which we promptly did. His name was Sergeant Rogers, and he was a ripped guy who had to be over 250 pounds. He walked like he had to be doing something at all times, but was not one of those yell-at-your-face fellows. Instead, he treated the men in his brigade as if he was another soldier just giving orders. After a few hours of setup, Carson, Paul, and I were sent off to investigate the thick jungle. Grabbing our rifles, we quickly walked through the middle of the jungle, scouting for anything that we could see. The place was quiet, and we heard nothing but the chirping of bugs in the distance and the occasional bird. If it wasn't for the war that was going on in this area, it would have been a beautiful vacationing spot. After a few hours and seeing mostly nothing, we were about to head back to the camp before Carson saw something in the distance. It looked like something man-made, like a rock building of some sort. We approached it, only to find it was a large abandoned temple of sorts. Thinking that something could be in there, we heard footsteps and somebody yelling in Vietnamese a few hundred feet away. It was the Vietcong. We then went back to camp and told our superiors the story of the temple in the middle of the jungle. He just laughed and said that there were old Buddhist temples which had been long forgotten. Even though our superior didn't care, we were still deeply interested in these temples. Another day came and we were again picked to scout out of the jungle. This time we decided to venture deeper into the thickness of the vines and trees. After a few miles, we saw a camp of the Reds. It was an encampment of a few hundred men, which were a mere 100 yards from us. We just looked at them, and looked at the entire encampment, not seeing any prisoners. We scouted the thickness of the jungle for a few hours, writing the daily log of what we saw and the reports of Rogers, which was mostly how many troops and how far away, etc. We stayed at the side of our camp for a few hours when the Red soldier approached us in the distance, not seeing us. He pulled something out of his pocket, and we were ready for the worst. It was just a Zippo lighter, and he went out for a smoke. Carson, who was hyped up to capture the guy, rendered a plan. He would go to the soldier, gag him, and try to get any information about the missing soldiers. We decided to put this plan into full effect and try to get anything out of the soldier. We surrounded the guy at all sides, approaching him slowly in a quiet fashion. It was about another 20 feet away from us when all we could smell was the cigarette burning rapidly now. Slowly walking as close as I could finally see the orange parts of the burning cigarette as he took it out of his mouth. I then grabbed my pistol and rag and went behind him, grabbing him quickly and gagging him. He was letting out some sort of muffled screams of help, but I wasn't going to let him go. Carson and Paul held him down as he kept screaming for us to let him go. Carson then told the man with the knife up to his neck in Vietnamese that if he screamed once more, we would cut his neck wide open. The man went quiet, sweating bullets out of fear for his life. Carson then started talking to the man in his native tongue about the information that he knew. The man and Carson talked for about 5 minutes until Carson, in disgust, let the man down and beat him with the butt of his rifle, leaving the man unconscious so we could get away. We then went on a ferocious hike back to camp. Tired and covered in mud from the jungle, I popped the question about what the man said. Carson, who was mad, blankly said, "The man said there's no prisoner of war camp near this area and the men from their encampment have been missing as well, expecting an American POW camp." I was dumbfounded, thinking that we hadn't had any disappearances since we came to the jungle, not captured any enemies since we got here. We walked back speechless into the encampment. The three of us walked to Roger's tent and explained to him that there were no prisoners at the camp and about the soldier. Rogers was almost confused as us, but then gave us orders to head back to our quarters as if something was bothering him. His face as we just stared at him was red mad, as if someone had murdered his wife. He then proceeded to yell at us to get back to our quarters, so we scurried back to our beds. "Why was Rogers so infuriated with us?" Paul said. "We did our job and scouted the enemy. What else does he want?" "I don't know, Paul. I think Rogers is hiding something from us and the other troops. That trooper at the Reds' camp also said something about a serpent-like creature when the disappearances occurred." "Why didn't you say anything to Rogers?" I asked. "He's never going to believe us. Plus, I think there's more to learn about the jungle," Carson explained. "Okay, we'll talk about it in the morning then," I sighed. "No, we cannot let anyone know about this," Paul yelled out. Carson hesitated and said to us, "Let's just keep this to ourselves for now. If something does happen, then we'll be ready for it." The three of us shook on it, proceeded nervously to the bunks. A few days passed by and we were preparing to advance towards the North Vietnamese camp that we spotted earlier. Rogers explained that this would be a routine mission and that we would be going deep into the jungle to attack the enemy. Rogers had a nervous look on his face, but was ready to send the troops into battle. We grabbed our equipment and supplies and walked through the jungle. Our first job was to clear a path removing the trees and any other debris, mostly with construction equipment and flamethrowers. Carson and I were put on flamethrower duty and Paul was put on clearing the debris. We spent another few hours clearing the trees and rocks before setting up camp deep within the forest. We began putting up sandbags and digging holes, preparing for the attack. Then we saw the Vietnamese. It was a counterattack force a few hundred yards away. We grabbed our weapons and soon a firefight engulfed the two forces as we battled deep into the night. Bullets were grazing past me and Paul as we reloaded our weapons. Paul had killed about 10 to 12 of the enemy before Rogers yelled out for the big guns. I was lucky if I even shot one or two guys, as this was my first real battle with real people. The grappling guns began firing on the enemy, as many of the Vietnamese were underpowered in weapons, running at us. We began taking them down with all the firepower we had. We began to cheer, but it wasn't long before those Reds kept appearing through the trees, their dead bodies just piling up on top of each other with evil in their eyes. Then everything started to fall apart. Snipers in the trees began to pick us off one by one, killing the many good men around me. Paul was grazed in the leg and Rogers was yelling out for retreat. All of us began to fall back as more and more bodies from our side began to fall. Rogers by then was already off of the battlefield and most of the survivors were running towards the south. I heard Paul cry out that he was shot in the leg. I grabbed him and put him over my shoulder as Carson gave us cover fire. It was then we were almost surrounded and began to run eastward. I shouted that the temple could be a place of refuge until the enemy left. We dragged Paul towards the temple, which was around a 2-mile walk. We then saw the temple in the moonlight, with its ancient vegetation growing all over the old stone walls. I began hearing sounds shouting behind us as we ran into the temple. It was dark and almost quiet for most of the night. I walked outside to find a few Reds just looking at me, seeing that I was in the temple. But they looked terrified and with blank expressions. They ran off shouting something in Vietnamese. They were yelling out, "Con wrong, con wrong." Confused and pissed, I sprayed a bunch of bullets to ward them off and ran back into the fortress. I said to Carson that those bastards were gone and that they were running for their own lives back into the jungle, not telling him what they said. Carson was busy tending to Paul's wounds, which were getting better, but he still couldn't walk on his own. I proceeded to walk through the old temple to get a feel for what we were in. Mostly what I found were statues of some fellow I didn't know of and paintings of dragons everywhere. The drawings depicted some people running out of the temple into the jungle being chased by a dragon-looking creature. The creature was yellow with red eyes and a red stripe. It had sharp teeth and a sinister-looking face, like it was going to devour someone. I walked deeper into the temple with my lighter looking at these paintings of dragons which would do anything from sitting on top of a temple to devouring people. I was deeply into these drawings when I heard a large bump at the end of the corridor. It was Carson. He was looking at the art with a shocked expression on his face. He said they were from a local dragon legend. According to Carson, the Vietnamese, like many East Asian cultures, were very intertwined with the dragons in their stories. He didn't know this particular story, but he said that dragons in Vietnamese culture are often said to be the bringers of rain, particularly in agriculture. He also said they believed the dragon to be a father figure to men, and it was even included in their creation stories. They signified that they brought much good to the world, but this dragon is very different from the ones in Vietnamese folklore. He said that this dragon was evil and was a vicious killer, not like the loving creatures typically depicted. Just as he was about to explain some more, we heard the screams of Paul in the distance. We ran back to Paul as he proclaimed that something was growling at him in the distance. We looked outside and couldn't see much. Just a silhouette of something in the distance staring at us. 2 big glowing red eyes. It looked like a damn large bird with the body of a worm. It was growling deep and loud. Almost looked like it had a huge lion-like snout. It was hunched over the body of a man who was screaming for his very life as the monster started eating him from the torso up. The creature ripped the flesh and tissue of the man, swallowing his intestines almost like spaghetti. It turned around and growled at us from outside of the temple and began waving its wings. Then it took off, flying towards the temple. Viciously, it tried to break in, giving us a good view of its face. We ran deeper into the temple, into a large atrium, and stayed there for a few hours, hearing the creature's snarls and screechings. It screamed and banged on the walls of the temple trying to get to us. We just remained in the atrium. Hours passed and it went silent for a while. We heard the occasional bird, and that was it. I picked up my lighter and made a makeshift fire with pieces of cloth and leaves. It was then I noticed the same silhouette of something in the background. I hopped back, thinking that was some beast, but it was just a statue of the same dragon covered in gold and ruby. Carson explained, "Whoever was here didn't just fear the creature. They also worshipped it." I walked towards the back of the atrium and noticed a room going to the back of the temple. It was a long line of stairs which proceeded to a room with an opening big enough to fit the dragon. Inside the room were drawings of dragons everywhere, and a large altar big enough to lie down on. It was covered in dirt and leaves, but it was definitely for sacrifices. There was found a lot of daggers nearby made of gold. I heard a hiss from above me. Slowly I looked up. Saw the dragon coming down at me with its claws. It just missed me but left a deep scratch on my leg. I heard its heavy breathing from the other side of the cabin. It let out a loud roar, filling the space with the stench of rotten flesh. We ran through the open door back to the atrium, but not before it grabbed my leg. With its claws digging in deep within my skin, I let out a shriek. Grabbing my revolver taken out of its holster, I shot it in the arm. It shrieked so horrifically I thought my eardrums were gonna pop. Regardless, we took the opportunity to get out of there. I escaped the beast by climbing back to the atrium where my colleagues were. We waited for daylight to come, which seemed like an eternity. Paul's bleeding was stopped, and we were trying to pick him up and proceed to walk out of the temple to civilization. My eyes began adjusting to the incoming daylight as we swiftly walked out of the temple towards the American camp. It seemed like hours before we found a crew of mangled corpses of the Vietnamese near a large tanker truck. They looked like they were ripped to shreds by nothing man-made. One of the men was ripped in half from the torso. His lower half was nowhere to be found. Another man only had his head left. Something had taken down an entire battalion of Vietnamese. We knew what did this, but weren't going to stay around for confirmation. We began to check the bodies and looked for any necessary supplies, finding water and some painkillers. We suddenly heard in the distance a faint cry for help. We walked in awe towards the dying man. He was yelling that word again in Vietnamese, "Con Rong." Carson talked to the man for a few words about a serpent with wings and how it ambushed them. He went on about how the creature would just not die, but how the creature slashed a huge gash into his leg. He was able to survive for a while but kept blanking in and out of consciousness. He then began going into shock and kept shouting the same word until he actually died. Con Rong. By then I was sick to my stomach and throwing up whatever contents was in my body. Trying to think to myself what the hell was going on. All I wanted to do was go home and never see this shit again. I took a swig of water from my canteen, which was halfway full. We looked through the entire tank, leaving the mangled bodies and corpses behind on the way back to camp. We stopped every so often to take a break, carrying Paul, which was okay for the time being. His leg, however, was beginning to show signs of infection. We finally saw the familiar sight of an American Jeep in the distance, hoping that someone was still alive. We had finally made it back to the American camp, which unfortunately seemed all but abandoned. Jeeps and tents all but empty in the area. Mostly everything charred, like it'd been on fire. The corpses began to appear just like the Vietnamese camp. Charred remains of men were all over the place, half-eaten men with their innards all over the place. It was a disaster zone. We began walking through the entire encampment, trying to find some life when we saw a handful of Americans, including Rogers. He was loading up gasoline into a large Jeep with a few injured and healthy people. We yelled at him, letting him know we were there. With a shocked look on his face, he snapped his head towards us, quickly waving at us to come towards him. We dragged Paul into the Jeep and put him on gently. Many of the men in the Jeep looked injured, even Rogers, who, upon closer inspection, looked scared out of his mind. He went on to tell us how everyone in the battalion was dead, but us, and that we were lucky to be alive. He later said that no one from either side was alive, including the Vietnamese. He paused and said, "After the retreat, we ran towards the base camp we had settled before and stopped there for prep work in the morning. And something came in the distance, attacked us. That thing was everywhere, slaying troops one by one with its big red eyes and bloody teeth. It flew around our jeeps and stopped everyone from leaving. Charred men, cooked them to death, ripping men apart piece by piece. We ran into the forest and hid in a small cave until the thing left. That's when I began finding survivors, and I began setting up this jeep." We then began talking about our own encounters with the creature and how it killed many men along the way. By the time we went explaining all our stories, we reached a small town outside of Saigon and went to the nearest American military post. Luckily, that's where my story ends. After that horrible encounter, all 12 of us were relieved of our military duty due to PTSD. We were never given an explanation on that serpent. We were flown back to the States and sent to the mental health division of the VA. There, the doctor said that the dragon was just the result of the stress we had endured, but I know what I saw. After the scramble, we all went our separate ways. As for the others of the few that survived, I only know what happened to Paul, Rogers, and Carson. Paul, after returning home, had his leg amputated. He lived a nice life, until he started having flashbacks of the dragon and the temple. He was later admitted to a mental health clinic in 1984, where he died a year later. Rogers, after returning home, worked at a local grocery store, where he later became the manager. However, due to constant headaches and hearing voices, he committed suicide in 1995, leaving a suicide note about how he was hearing voices from outside of his window and seeing red eyes behind him. As for Carson, he still contacts me, and after returning home, got his degree in Eastern Religious Studies from the University of Michigan. Still studying about the dragon in the tomb, and has implied that he might go back to Vietnam trying to solve the mystery of the murders. As for all of the other men slaughtered by the dragon, I don't know. It was never explained to me what happened to the many people that perished by that creature. In the end, I still know what I saw, and I know the other 2 men saw what I did. That thing still stalks me in my dreams and my sleep. The doctors from the VA still say that it's the stress of being in war, but I know what I saw, and it was not a hallucination. I know that thing is still out there waiting to kill me, waiting to skin me alive, waiting to kill me with its razor-sharp teeth and its blood-red eyes. And it will still be waiting for me in my dreams, waiting patiently.